Another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Happy Friday. It is August 6th, 2021. Thanks for tuning into the stream today. Whether you are watching me live or watching the recording, appreciate you being here. If this is your first time watching the stream, I know we get new viewers here every single day, which is awesome. This is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. I take questions in through our email inbox, support@sabersim.com, through YouTube chat live while I'm on stream, through our office hours channel in Slack, either ahead of the stream or live. And I answer questions and really kind of let you guys drive the conversation here. So we do this live for a reason. I want follow-up questions and clarifying questions, right? I know I say this every single day, but I just want to emphasize that the whole reason that I do this live and we do this on a stream and we do this in video is so that you guys feel like you're getting complete answers to your questions. You're understanding kind of everything going on behind the scenes or that's affected by certain questions or things like that. If I explain something or I'm answering a question, it doesn't really get at what you guys are trying to ask or help you solve the problem you're trying to solve, let me know and we'll dive back in, right? That said, too, the best streams we have on here are when we are getting engagement from you guys, when people are adding things to the conversation in YouTube chat or in the Office Hours channel on Slack. So those are the best two places to do that while I am here live. Let's see. We've got a handful of questions here to get into today, but always plenty of time to talk about everything. So if you've got questions, go ahead and start building me up a queue in the YouTube chat or again, Office Hours channel on Slack, and we will make sure we go ahead and get to everything. Got a few good questions here to dive into, but I think that is pretty much it in terms of my normal introduction. We'll go ahead and just start diving in. We got, let's see. First question here from Adam in Slack. I'll go ahead and start here. Let me pull up the app so we can have this up. We got a fun 14-game slate here for baseball tonight, which should be fun. But this first question is actually, I think, about esports. Specifically, looks like League of Legends. So Adam said, if questions on niche sports are fair game, yes, they definitely are. Then here's one for LoL and maybe other similar sports. How should we interpret SaberScore given that the lineup builder doesn't consider field size or number of entries? So it gives the same Saber scores for a large League of Legends MME as we would for a 10-person single entry. Is it just that there's not enough variation in lineup construction to matter for a sports like this? Or am I misunderstanding something more general about SaberScore? Thanks per usual, much appreciated. Yeah, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. We'll go over to League of Legends. So the actual thing that's going on here is that we just haven't had the time yet. Oh, hang on. I locked up on me here. One sec. Let me go ahead and reload my app. But the main thing here is that we just haven't really had the time yet to do like a rigorous by contest analysis for different contest sizes for League of Legends. So that's basically kind of what goes on here behind the scenes when we are doing, let me pull it back up here. So I've mentioned here before with the way the sliders work, right? So when we say these are the sliders for a 20 max 10 to 50K entrance, what we're actually saying is that we've looked at historical 20 max 10 to 50K entrance, built thousands of lineups on every single slider setting, and seen what the highest expected value lineups are at what slider setting, and those become the defaults, right? So we've done some data-driven backtesting of the League of Legends default sliders for different slate sizes and things like that, but we haven't had a chance to do a contest-specific kind of rigorous default slider analysis at the moment, which is why they don't show up. And we just have a single set of defaults. And of course, you can edit these from here. So, I mean, I would say this, right? As you're getting familiar with what the sliders are doing and what they tend to do when certain contest sizes change, you will slowly kind of begin to learn maybe what makes sense to do in other sports like this when your contest sizes start to change, right? Ideally, I mean, I think long-term, we'd like to have the contest drop-downs here, but we can kind of think through this for the moment, right? Using a lot of the principles and the topics that we've been talking about here lately. You will see that in general, when the size of your contest grows and the number of entries that you have available to you grows, smart randomness in this case, or smart diversity, typically goes up. right? We need lineups that are embrace a little more variance to get that upside. We're willing to sacrifice average performance, and smart randomness goes up. So if you were playing a 10-person single entry, vice versa, I think it would probably be safe to assume that this can come down a little bit. We can rely on the value of the projections themselves to take a lot of this for us. Smart randomness can come down. Maybe if you're playing a King of the Rift satellite where there's like one ticket up top, it's very top heavy and you need to embrace a lot of randomness, maybe we are turning this up, right? And you could test this by looking at something like baseball or another sport or something like that, and seeing how it handles diversity or randomness as your contest size gets bigger or as your entry limit gets bigger. Same thing with ownership, right? It's probably likely that we want to fade ownership a little bit more the bigger the contest is, the top heavier the contest is, and the more entries you have, or the more entries anyone has, right? Those are kind of general trends that we see going on here. I think in general, correlation is probably the slider that's least likely to move in League of Legends. I know we talked about in our League of Legends and CSGO strategy session we did now a couple months ago. That's up on YouTube if you want to watch it. We had Max on and Will talking about esports strategy. Max had mentioned that he would pretty much recommend just generally setting a stack rule here, a 4 stacking rule, almost regardless of whatever you're playing for League. It just almost always makes sense to set that 4 stack rule. And then I don't know necessarily how much we want to tweak the correlation slider based on contest size. I think just in general, we know that we want to build lineups with 4 stacks when we're playing League DFS. But again, like I think that's kind of bridging the gap from being kind of reliant on our default sliders to kind of really getting the patterns here that's going on with the default sliders. And once you can kind of start to see some of the stuff for why smart diversity goes up when you're having a 50K 150 max versus a 10-person single entry, right? You can start to take advantage of that, and you can start to understand not only in a sport like League where we don't have the contest specific dropdowns at the moment, and we have to make some adjustments on our own, but even for different slates like on baseball or sports that we have these drop downs anyway, right? You can start to identify, well, I'm paying a little bit of a top heavier contest. I don't know why my app's not loading here. I'm playing a little bit of a top heavier contest tonight. So I'm going to turn up my smart diversity and my ownership a little bit because I get that what those are going to do is emphasize upside at the expense of average performance. So I realize the question I have up on screen is not the most useful part of the question. So I know a few people are trickling in here as the stream's getting going this morning. If you missed it, we're talking about basically moving your sliders based on different contest types, different contest options, things like that for League of Legends, where we don't have the drop downs at the moment. So let's see, Adam, don't know if you are here watching with me live here today. Let me know if that helps. I guess kind of in summary here, coming around full circle, I would say definitely feel empowered to make changes to your sliders when you're playing League of Legends contests. The bigger the contest and the greater the entry limit, I would say the higher you want to tick up your smart randomness and your ownership fade a little bit. If you're playing much smaller contests, some of these like especially like something like a 10-person single entry, I would say bring those sliders down a little bit. You can use something like baseball sliders or something too, like another sport with correlation, and get an idea of maybe where those should be. But great question. They definitely should change based on your contest too. So it's just mostly a limitation of where our priorities have been so far that we don't have the contest drop downs, but you would expect that they would change. So okay, cool. 1 second here. We'll go ahead and keep this going. All right, let me get my app pulled back up here. I lost my screen share for a moment, and we'll just keep it going here. Cool. Okay, next question here. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to hit all these questions we got in Slack here ahead of the show, and then we'll get into some of the questions that are strolling in live here. But this question's from James here. And do you ever play the same lineup build twice in a 20-entry GPP contest? Likewise, do you ever play the same lineup multiple times in a max 150? You never want to do this, right? You never want to be duplicated in your GPP contests, much less be duplicated by yourself, right? The reason why here, we had a similar question earlier this week. So let me go ahead and pull this up here. And I made a little spreadsheet to show off why, right? So I'm not going to walk through this spreadsheet in as much detail here because I did walk through this in detail the other day. And I will link a timestamped link to the strategy or to the office hours where I talked about this in more detail here in office hours. But basically what this does is it is going to assume for a random 100-man contest, $10 to first with like a very top-heavy prize structure, what your ROI is if you win the contest, right? You 49x your $10 entry if you win 500 for first. You 24x your $10 entry if you win the 250K for first. Well, I guess you 25x it, right? But this is taking into account what you pay to get in. So this is like your ROI. If you assume you are duplicated by anyone in the contest, right? Your ROI is going to start dropping significantly because your prize pool ends up being shared with the positions, the number of people that are sharing it, right? So if you split first with somebody else, you actually share the combined total of first and second, which brings your ROI down. It brings your overall profitability down for a contest because you were duplicated here. And if you duplicate yourself, it is even worse because then what you're doing is you're paying to reduce your own ROI, right? This number would drop even more because not only did you get duplicated and those two lineups took down first and second, but you actually paid $20 instead of $10 to do it. So, yeah, definitely. I'll go ahead again. I talked about this at length here earlier this week. I think it might have been last week now. So I will go ahead and link this timestamped recording in Slack so that anyone that wants to watch it can see it after I get off here today's show. This is also one I've gotten a few other questions about duplication recently. So this is another one that I'm going to pull out snip as a separate video and post this in our office hours greatest hits so that people can find it really easily because I think this is a good topic. This is a good thing to have pulled out of an office hours video, isolated so that people can reference it as needed. But generally speaking, never want to get duplicated. Definitely don't want to pay to duplicate yourself. So, but really good question. Okay, cool. So let's go here now to Brian's question. This is another good one. And he said, when adjusting ownership projections, say for a pitcher on FanDuel, does it matter if the total for all the players doesn't add up to 100? So in theory, yes. In practice, probably not. I'll go ahead and explain what I mean there and why. So yes, in general, your ownership projection should be adding up to the total ownership available for the position. So on FanDuel, one pitcher site, the ownership projection should all add up here to 100. You'll find that they typically do. It seems like maybe the app is a little bit slow here today on me, which is a little bit annoying here. I'm going to stop the screen share again. Give me a second to let the page come back up here. And I'll just keep answering this question while I'm working on getting this spun back up. So, right, it makes sense. It stands to reason that our ownership projections need to add up to 100. If there's however many pitchers on the slate, and everyone gets one, the total ownership of the entire position should add up to 100, right? And that's why I said, in theory, yes, if you're going to add 20 points of ownership to one pitcher, in theory, you need to take those away from somewhere else. Now, in practice, the reason why I don't think you need to necessarily do this is because when we actually make our ownership fade calculation for each lineup. Okay, I've got it up here now. This will help. It will be easier for me to explain when I've got this up. Okay, so when we actually make our ownership fade calculation and decide how much we want to value a certain player, we are comparing them to the average. We are comparing them to the average ownership projection for the position. So I don't know that this is exactly right, but let's just assume that 14 games, right? Each game has 2 pitchers in it. So there's 28 pitchers on the slate, right? And there's 100 total pitching ownership. So 100 divided by 28 would mean that the average pitching ownership is 3.57 basically. So when we consider a pitcher's ownership here, right, and decide whether or not we want to fade them or to what extent we want to fade them, they're all getting considered up against the average pitching ownership. So anyone that is above 3.57 is going to be considered higher than average owned, right? So you can see all these guys all the way down to right about here. And then everyone below this is going to be considered lower than average owned for the position, right? That's how the ownership fade slider works. So if you think that the projections are wrong, especially if you don't have a lot of time and you think, and you're just doing really quick updates and you're like, no, I actually think Burns is going to be 20%. And I think Bassett's going to be 15% or something like that, right? In theory, these ownership projections now are not possible. Not everyone could possibly be owned to this extent here. But again, in practice, all that's going to happen here is the average ownership is going to also go up, and everyone is still going to be considered, their ownership is still going to be considered against the average. So it really won't end up having like a practical negative effect on the way your lineups end up being constructed overall. So that's kind of why I say for this question, in theory, yes, you should move things down. In practice, you don't need to worry about it. So especially with time, right? I find that when I'm doing my ownership projections and making edits to things, it's very easy to just go through and quickly bump up the guys that you think are under-owned. It doesn't always make as much sense to go in and find where you're going to get that 20 or 25 points of ownership back that you need to remove here, especially when you're just trying to figure out what your approach to the slate is overall. It's just not a good use of time, I found. So not something you really need to overly worry about here because of the way that average ownership comes into play. So Brian, I don't know if you're watching me here live. Let me know if that was helpful. Otherwise, of course, I'll get you a recording. You can always follow up with me and we'll talk about anything more related to that if we need. So, okie dokie, cool. Let's go ahead and keep moving. I'm gonna hop over to YouTube chat here where we have some questions that came in right at the start of the show here. Aaron said, quick question: would you play chalk stacks if the chalk is just the play once you go through a process? Yeah, I mean that can happen, and there are slates like that. There have been slates like that this week. I can't remember. Maybe it was Monday's slate where I was going through my process and I was saying that the Yankees are obviously going to be the most owned team. I think it was their first game in Baltimore, so that might have been Monday this week, right? And you're going through the process and you see the Vegas lines, and obviously the Yankees are going to be the most owned hitting stack on the slate. And then I'm going through my process and I'm doing my research build, and I'm seeing that, yeah, I'm projecting that the Yankees bats are going to be like 30% owned, but I think they end up being optimal like 25 to 35% of the time. And it seems like the ownership is right. Yeah, they're the best play. The field's on them. They're the best play. I'm going to play them. And so that does happen. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think when that particular situation comes up, there's a few things I like to do in that case. One is, I find in general that the field is going to be inefficient somewhere. I don't know why this is going slow for me here today, but I find that the field is going to be inefficient somewhere, and it doesn't necessarily need to be on the most owned stack, right? Like my approach on that particular slate ended up being was that I felt that the next best team up, which was the Giants on that particular slate, even though they were second or third on Vegas odds, I thought they were going to be the second or third most owned team. Because of the fact that I thought the Yankees were far and away the best stack on the slate, I felt like the second best team, the second highest projected team, was actually going to be overweight based on their potential. Even though they weren't the chalkiest team, I still felt like the field was going to overstate their outcomes compared to what their relative upside was. So my stand on that slate actually ended up being fading the second chalkiest team, which didn't pay off. I think that night, the Giants ended up actually having a good total. The Yankees did not. But I think the larger point here is, yeah, if you are being led through your process and you think that, yeah, you have a very chalky team, but they are appropriately chalky, their projected ownership or how much you think the field is going to use them matches up with their upside potential overall, I think it's perfectly fine to go ahead and play them. One thing that I would do, or at least consider doing at that point, is then either one, looking to see if the field is if you can find leverage somewhere else, if the field is maybe overstating the upside of the second or third best stack or a pitcher or something like that. And then also a lot of times, if I am biting the bullet on playing the chalkiest stack on the slate, a lot of times I will at that point eliminate some of my 2 and 3 piece stacks of that team for the same reason we've talked about before, right? Where if I'm just all in on playing the chalky stack, playing the chalky big stack, I don't want to play them in a form that provides additional upside to the people that stacked them bigger than I did. So again, using the same Yankees idea from before, I wouldn't have wanted to play 2 and 3 piece stacks of that team, because if I think that they're the highest upside team on the slate, I think the field is correctly judging their upside and making them the chalkiest team on the slate. I want to stack them as big as possible. I don't want to use a 2-piece stack or a 3-piece stack where if those pieces of that stack have success, all they do is provide additional at-bats to a lot of other lineups that have more players on the Yankees. I've talked about this a lot before. So that's one thing I will do. That's typically when I do that, is when I'm playing chalk, is I will make sure I am playing only big stacks of the chalk for hitters, for stacks. And then, hopefully my process is leading me to lesser owned one-offs or smaller stacks or pitchers in lineups like that. That happens pretty much naturally by having an ownership fade slider that is approximately moderate, or whatever. So, but good question. Question from Anthony here. I see one of two, but I only see one question. So I'll read this. We'll tackle this one. I've noticed the last couple of days, there are always players in baseball that SaberSim has high ownership projections for that end up being significantly lower owned than anticipated, or vice versa. Assume the question here is maybe why, or what can we do about that? Yeah, so similar question came in yesterday, right? And I mentioned yesterday, I think, so at the moment, the way our ownership model is working is that it is using our projections and assuming that that is what the field is likely to do, right? And that can be wrong, or that can be a bad assumption if we are already fairly different than the field on a certain team. I see. Okay, actually, I see this question came in here on Slack as well, and it has the full part of the question. So, yeah, I just saw that, Anthony. So let me finish the question here. Vice versa, maybe this is because other players are savvy enough to fade perceived chalk plays. Any advice on using a test build that helps account for this to see which players may not be what SaberSim is projecting ownership for? Specifically, any recommended settings to use for these ownership test builds? Yes. Okay. So very good question. Again, so the problem here, or the limitation in the ownership model, this is something we fully intend to kind of improve here going forward, right? But the way the ownership model works at the moment, it is assuming that what SaberSim's projections say is what most of the field is going to do, right? So again, if we are far off or fairly even a little bit off on every team across the entire slate, especially on a big 14-game slate, those little ripple effects can have a pretty big impact, and sometimes lead us to being a little bit off on ownership, right? So I mentioned yesterday, I think a good way to start looking at this is to see and just verify that the teams that have very high totals are close to what we do, right? So for example, the Yankees are the highest projected owned team on the slate, the highest implied total on the slate based on Vegas, which makes me think they are going to be the most owned stack. But you can see that we don't have them as that team, right? We have the Reds, the Rays, the Astros are tied with them, and the Dodgers are tied with them, right? Implying that like what we probably think the ownership projections are going to work out, while the Yankees hitters are likely to be hitters that show up as fairly high owned plays, this may not indicate as clearly as we think the field is likely to think that these players are owned, right? If the field thinks that the Yankees are the best run environment on tonight's slate by 0.3 runs, and we think that they are tied for the third best run environment, right? That's going to have an impact on the ownership projection. So I think from there, you can use that as a tool to just quickly make adjustments based on the top few teams at the top of the board, right? I've noticed, and also, I mean, baseball is hard to project ownership for, right? Like there's a lot of salary things that come into play here. There's just a ton of players in the pool. It's a difficult problem to project ownership for. But the field, I think, is relatively consistent in what they are likely to do. And I found that even if you just isolate maybe the top, I don't know, third of the teams on the slate, or the top teams, the top 5 or 6 teams, right? You can kind of get a quick idea of what the field is likely to do just by looking at the Vegas totals. So this would indicate to me that it's going to be Yankees, Reds, White Sox, Braves, Houston. There's a Coors game on the slate tonight, right? So probably include the Rockies in there, and then maybe starting to get into some teams that are a little less likely to be owned. What I like to do from there is just quickly like double or 1.5x my ownership projections for these players. And I think this is just a very quick and easy way to get an idea of what the chalk is, to get relatively close, and to allow the ownership fade slider to take effect a little bit more accurately what the field is going to do. So maybe we're like, again, just quickly like doing something like this. And it's a 14-game slate tonight, so maybe these guys aren't just like obscenely chalky. Maybe they are. You can kind of go with what you think is appropriate, but maybe we 3x them. Maybe they go like 15, 15, something like this. Struggling to get through these here. But you get the idea, right? And again, this is the same point I mentioned in the first question we had for the show today. I don't think you then necessarily need to go back and adjust some other team down, because all you're going to do is basically slightly bump up the average projected ownership on each position, right? And that will kind of take care of itself when we compare. Again, ownership fade is the comparison of each individual player's individual ownership against the average ownership for the position. So you shouldn't really need to worry about going in and bumping anyone's ownership back down because there's a team you bump up. I would say if you want to have a pretty rigorous look at ownership, or find a way of kind of really taking a closer look. So we've talked a little bit about chalk builds here before. And the chalk build is running a build that is basically setting the style to cash and just setting a 5-stack rule and building lineups. And what you're going to get out of this is you're going to get lineups that look like basically what somebody might do if they were... Sorry that the app is slow for me here today. I will look into this and figure out why as soon as I'm off. I'm not really sure why, but it seems like it's just kind of going slow. But what this is going to do is it's basically going to mimic somebody using a traditional optimizer that doesn't do all the things SaberSim does in terms of calculating upside and handling or ownership organically and things like that. And basically, what kind of lineups would somebody that just says, build me lineups with 5 stacks and press go look like? And this can be really useful. I think the problem here is that you are subject to the same limitations that you are with the ownership projections, right? We are still using our projections for these things. So if you wanted to get very dialed in, or you wanted to take this one step further, and this for the moment is going to be a bit tedious, I would say probably the next best thing you could do would be to go through and adjust your, I forgot White Sox were in the day game. Go through and adjust your team totals to match Vegas and then run a chalk build. And that's going to make adjustments to projections, assuming that somebody is using a very Vegas-driven projection model, which there are a lot of people out there doing that, using a traditional optimizer and forcing a 5-stack rule. And that is going to be a very, I think it's a very thorough way of figuring out what the chalk is going to be on a slate. Now, the problem with that is, for the moment, if you go through and adjust a bunch of team totals, and this really sucks, and I've done this, and it's annoying, you have to manually turn them back off. So I would say that's something that you probably just want to do once, if you're going to do it at all, maybe in the middle of the day when you have time to adjust things back, because my app's kind of going slow here, but it typically takes a couple seconds to put each one back to where they're supposed to be. But that is probably the most like thorough way to get an idea of what the ownership is going to be on the slate, right? Because we are setting our projections all the way back to, we're setting our projections to Vegas, assuming like a heavily Vegas driven model. And we are running a build with no correlation, well, a 5-stack, but no ownership fade, no smart diversity, and just seeing what lineups we get out of there. So Anthony said, yes, we need a button that resets all the teams at once. Thank you for the advice. The app is slow for me too, by the way. Okay, I will follow up with the team and figure out what's going on with the app slowdowns. On that button that resets all teams at once, that is coming with our visual update that we are hoping to ship this month. So it is very close. It will be here soon. It is probably my favorite. Well, I don't want to say that. It's one of my favorite features on the new redesign. So it should make everything a lot better. Should make doing that a lot better, right? You can go through, quickly update all the team totals, run a chalk build, get an idea of what the field is going to do, and just click reset all and get right back to default SaberSim really quickly. So our long-term vision here, again, is that we'll handle this more like for you, right? This isn't our long-term goal for ownership. We know, we believe in our ownership model, but no model's perfect, and we know there's room for us to improve there. So long-term, the goal would be to do some of this for you, incorporate it into the ownership model, and tighten up the ownership projections. But that is what I would recommend for now, as you are working through. I don't know. I lost my train of thought as you're adjusting ownership. So, all right, cool. Let's see. Couple other questions trickling in here. James said, do we have MMA projections, or should I upload them from elsewhere? If so, where should I upload them from? We do have MMA. So, I don't have my screen up here now. Let me go ahead. Actually, I'm stopping the slowdown, so I'll just go ahead and say yes. James, we do have MMA projections, and you should see them in the app. So I think there are a couple fights that we're missing projections. We're working on getting those fixed at the moment, but they are there. And yeah, right now they are raw projections. They're not based on sims. We have a MMA sim that we're working on behind the scenes here, getting ready to push that out, make sure that we're happy with the way that's working. But we do have pretty solid MMA projections in the app at the moment. So, okay, cool. Real quick. Okay, let's go ahead and keep us rolling here. Got a question from Neaton here. Hi team, I'm doing backtesting on league matches for NBA. Does smart diversity work on less variant sport like basketball? Also, apart from projections, which metric for SaberSim? Okay, I'm a little bit confused on the second part of the question there, but yes, smart diversity does still work for NBA. It is still, I think it is still just as valuable, even in a sport that is a little less variant. So let me go see if I can pull an old slate up and then share my screen again, and we can kind of talk about it. Oh, that's just a 2-gamer. That's not a very good one. Let's see. There's a 9-game slate. Let's see if I can get this up. Okay, yep, we do. So here we go. Okay, so I've got some random 9-game slate from earlier this season, right? So you'll see for default sliders, we do have smart diversity, right? It's a little bit lower than it is in a sport like baseball for a typical size contest, right? The sport is a little less variant. We can trust average projections a little bit more, but it's still a really valuable tool in terms of a way of bucketing our sims to create diversity and emphasize upside in our lineups, looking at real ranges of outcomes, right? So especially on smaller contests like single entry, you can see smart diversity really start to get pretty low for a sport like basketball, but it's still a very important part of the process. It still pops up, especially when you're playing big stuff like these big 150 maxes where you need a lot of upside to take these contests down. Definitely still something that you will see present in the builder. So are you planning on NBA Summer League projections? I don't think so. I think that's already started, and we don't have projections up for that. Our big push right now is getting ready for a football season, starting up here in about a month. So we have a lot of work that we're doing on the football model, the football builder, things like that, preparing for that. So we will be focusing some attention back on the NBA start of the season in October when the regular season starts back up. So a lot of work will be going on in September and October here to prepare for basketball, but we don't have NBA Summer League projections. So, and then which metric should be used on SaberSim or overall basketball as DFS? I'm sorry, man. I'm still a little bit confused on this question as well. Apart from the projections, which metric for SaberSim, which I'm sorry, I'm still a little bit confused on what this question is asking here. So maybe you could give me a little bit more information on what you're kind of looking for, and I'm happy to dive back into this one. But not so sure. So I'm going to move on here for now, but if you've got some additional context there for me, just shout it out into YouTube and I will go ahead and jump back. But let me see here. Okay, awesome. So that question was a duplicate here. I'm going to jump to a question we got in our support channel here. I think this is an interesting one. And we will dive in here. So the question says, I've done my research build for the FanDuel MLB slate. I've identified the teams I want to be exposed to based on ownership and potential. How should I then proceed? Force a 4-stack of each of the teams. Let SaberSim run optimal based on build settings, then adjust exposure manually to the teams I identified. If I run the optimal or force a 4-stack, SaberSim will still put my identified teams onto 2 or 3-man stacks. I guess I'm just stuck on how to proceed once I've identified the teams I want to be on after the research build. Do I zero out stack exposure to every other team I don't want stacked? Okay, so this is a really good question. And I think this is starting to get into thinking about styles of your individual process, what that looks like to you, right? None of the ways that you've presented here in this question are necessarily wrong. There are pros and cons to each approach. So I would say, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this here, but I would say the first thing to think about is how rigid do you want to be with your overall approach, right? If you've completed your research build and if you've identified the teams that you want to 4-stack and you don't want any other teams to show up as a 4-stack, I would say you probably should set a rule for that. Because what it's going to do is it's going to give you a full pool of lineups that you already know you want, and you can do follow up a little bit of additional tweaking and things like that with a full pool from there. If you just let the builder build all your lineups and then go through and cross off all the lineups that don't include what you want, you're just going to be left with a much smaller pool. And that smaller pool is going to be a little less flexible to any follow-up exposure editing you want. So let me go ahead and flip back over to FanDuel here. And let's just say, for example, that we have identified the teams we want to stack. And for the sake of argument here, you know what? I think this is just going to be a little bit too slow for me to really get this done at the moment. So I guess let me see if I can get this going here. Okay, so for example, right, let's say we were just stacking all the teams that have a 5 implied run total or greater. So let's just go back to our default settings here. And we wanted every team that has a 5 run total. So that's Seattle and New York. And here, let's turn everything off, right? You can do this with a stacking rule here and set this in advance. So we're going to have 4 minimum, and we have Tampa Bay and Toronto and Cleveland, right? And again, obviously, this is probably going to lead us to playing some chalky lineups, but this is just a way to do this quickly as an example here, right? And what this approach, again, so just to emphasize here, what this approach is going to do is it's going to build us a pool of lineups that we already know that we're going to like, or at least are a good starting point, because we're not going to have to go through and eliminate all the other lineups that have all these other teams. So I know there was a note here about if I run optimal or force the 4-stack, SaberSim will still put my identified teams onto a 2 or 3-man stack. That makes sense to me. There's a way you could eliminate that from necessarily happening. Like, obviously, if you run this kind of build, it's very likely that you could build a lineup that has a Seattle 4-stack, but maybe features a New York 2-stack, right? If you wanted to say something like, I only want to use these teams as 4-stacks, and I never want to use these teams as my minor stack, the way you could do that would be by setting another stack rule in here and saying that you need to use at least 2 players from another team, right? And select all the other teams, the exact opposite teams from before, right? So if we said, now all of a sudden we could do a build like this, right? And this is going to say every lineup is going to have at least 4 players from the teams I identified I wanted to 4-stack, and the 2 players, at least 2 players, are going to be from every other team in here, right? I think this is a little bit of a rigid build. I don't know if this is necessarily like a positive. I think this maybe is a little bit too rigid. I think this maybe restricts you from a lot of types of lineups that have win equity. But if you wanted to avoid what you've described here in the question, where you force your 4-stack and then have the same lineup showing up as minor stacks, you could do it this way. Everything that you do before the build, by either editing projections or adding build rules, is going to be a very kind of brute force method that's going to it's going to change the way the lineups are built, right? Like, you will get 0% of the teams that you said you didn't want to 4-stack. So I would keep that in mind. That's one possible limitation there. The other way you can approach this is to do a lot of this in the post-build process in step 3, which is going to allow you to maybe introduce a little bit more flexibility here, or like allow the input of SaberSim to still kind of shine through. So let's go ahead and go back here and now say we're just running a 20 max, and we're going to do it this time, and we're not going to have any rules ahead of time, right? We're going to just do a default build. We're going to see what we get, and then we're going to make some changes to our exposures here on step 3. And again, the advantage here is that if there's a team that maybe you didn't pick up on in your research build that SaberSim really likes, you're going to get an opportunity to still use them. It's going to allow you to be under the field on stacks, right? So say maybe there's a certain team that has a high upside potential, but is also going to be pretty highly owned, and you had eliminated it. Maybe SaberSim thinks that the best way to approach that team is actually to just be underweight on that team rather than eliminating them completely. It's going to allow you to do things like that. So let's go ahead and look, right? The way we would want to do that here is to come over to our team stacks tab and engage more directly with the exposures. We could say, for example, that we didn't want, we could go here actually and say, like, let's eliminate Pittsburgh, right? Pittsburgh wasn't on our list, not a high team total, not a very exciting offense, but San Diego's one that's interesting, right? Tatis is out. We weren't thinking about San Diego before. They didn't pop in our research build, but maybe we want to leave them in. Miami's another one that's interesting too, right? Didn't show up in our research, wasn't on our list, but now that they're showing up in a lineup, I know they're playing at Coors, I'm okay with keeping them, right? And it's going to allow some of this to kind of show up. You could also be totally still very rigid here with your approach, and still just eliminate the teams you don't want from step 3 and narrow down. So I think all 3 of these teams were on our original list, right? So, like, again, either of these approaches are fine here. I think it just depends a lot on how flexible you're willing to be and what you're looking for out of your build. One thing so I like to do as much of my process as possible in step 3 in the exposures, because I often think about my pool as being my pool of viable lineups, right? My playground of kind of viability for the slate. So if I'm playing 20 lineups on FanDuel and they're in a contest about this size, I think, okay, I've got about 500 different ways that I can go. And I use this as a bit of a guardrail to prevent myself from going too far off from what SaberSim is kind of giving to me. And when I'm making changes and I'm crossing teams off, for example, and I'm going through and maybe I'm finding that these are going to be my leverage spots on the night. So I'm going to eliminate a bunch of these teams, and maybe I'm taking a stand at the chalkiest pitcher, Burns or something like that, right? I can then kind of go through and check how far deep have I had to go into my pool, how far down have I had to go into my projected score and my Saber score, et cetera. And I get an idea. I have, like, in relative terms, a way of quantifying how far outside of the top lineups am I going. But that does mean, of course, that I have less lineups to overall play with here, right? If I had a ton of changes I wanted to make, eventually I'm going to see a message that says I have to build more lineups. And I guess so then the counter, the other side of the coin here, the pro of doing things ahead of the build, is that you're going to build a full pool of lineups that are exactly the way you want, right from the beginning. So I could go in here and say I'm eliminating Burns, maybe that's my fade, and I set the stack rule as we did before and build me 500 lineups that look exactly the way I want. And then you could get really nitty and really nitty gritty with your individual exposures, because every lineup in your full pool of 500 looks the way you intended. So, like, this is a really great question. This is awesome. And this is when you start getting into I think a lot of what's really fun and what's really flexible with SaberSim, and developing your own individual style or process, right? I know, like, when I talk to Max, he does a lot of his work up front with projections, right? And uses editing projections as a way for him to find his leverage, so that when he's going and building his build, he's building 500 or 1,500 lineups that look exactly the way he wants to for the slate. And I do a lot of my work on the exposures, because I like to build a pool of lineups that just are what SaberSim thinks is the way to play the slate, and then make my edits within those bounds, and use the message that I've done too much, or I'm need to build more lineups as a guardrail against me doing too much, and that kind of thing. So a lot of different ways to play, a lot of different ways. Once you are familiar with, like, how you're identifying your teams and how you're identifying the way you want to attack the slate, there's a lot of ways to proceed. There's not necessarily one right way or one wrong way. I will say, before I move on here, let me go ahead and pull this up. And I will link this when I send you the timestamp. I don't remember. Let me go ahead and just pull this up here. So we did a strategy session recently that was basically intended to be around this topic. So again, I've got the YouTube channel for SaberSim pulled up here, right? Third playlist down is strategy sessions. And we had the strategy, the 5 ways to build winning DFS lineups. I think at one point this was going to be called the 5 styles of winning DFS players. But either way, this strategy session is very much about this kind of topic, right? Especially for somebody that starts to know what their process looks like, how they find the plays, how they find what they want to attack on a certain slate. We talked about kind of 5 different, like, styles or different ways to create that in your process. One of them being editing projections and making a lot of use of editing projections. One of them being very intentional with editing exposures. One of them was a very ownership focused approach, where you're really dialing in on ownership and making edits there. We talked about thinking about your lineups as core plays, right? And there are players out there that like to go after their plays as, like, a core. So, like, a core play approach to this problem would be something like, let me think about it. So a core play approach would be something like setting, like, maybe a stack rule of, okay, I'm actually only playing, like, 3 teams. So I'm playing the 3 highest teams that are projected here, right? These are the only 3 teams I want to go after. And they are maybe New York, Tampa Bay, and Cleveland. Something like that. And I'm fading Burns, and I'm playing Bassett in every lineup or something like that, right? Like a really rigid core plays approach, then building a whole build around that. And with 500 or 150 lineups, you would have a ton of different combinations around these different cores. So there's different styles to doing this, and there's different pros and cons to going about it each way. And I think this is really where a lot of the fun of this all comes in, is like, you know, you can be you can handle this a lot of different ways, and you can be a sharp DFS player, and you can find your edge on every individual slate. And then there's a ton of different ways to get your particular type of value out of SaberSim. So I talked about this for a really long time. Hopefully that was kind of clear. I would say, like, in summary here, the more flexible you want to be, the more flexible you are willing to be, the more I would say you want to do this work at the end of the process in the exposures. The more rigid and the more firm you want to be on your approaches to the slate, the more you want this to happen up front. So if the answer to the question, are you willing to play any stacks outside of the ones you identified in your research builds, is no, then set a stacking rule. If the answer is yes, I'm willing to like at least consider that depending on how the build works out, then I would say don't set a stacking rule, handle that with your exposures in step 3. And it doesn't have to be one or the other either. You could do a little bit of both. But that's kind of what I would say there. So really good question. And if you watch this back and have some follow-up questions for me, just let me know. I'm happy to dive into this a little bit further, but really, really good stuff here. So. All right, guys, it is 12:50 local time here for me today, approaching the end of the week. Any other questions for me here before we start wrapping up for the week? We've got 10 minutes or so left. Happy to answer any other questions for me. If there was any follow-up from anything we talked about here today or anything that you're a little confused on, we've had another good show. We talked a lot about ownership. We talked about the impact of editing ownership projections, and also what maybe some tools or some opportunities to know when to do that. We talked about build settings and build rules for the niche sports like League of Legends, which was an interesting conversation. We talked a little bit about what else? We had a little bit more on duplication, some MMA questions, a little bit of NBA stuff. So some fun sports we haven't had an opportunity to talk about in a little while. Question from Neeson here again, from India. Do you plan to do cricket projections? DFS cricket in India is much bigger than DraftKings plus FanDuel combined. I'm using SaberSim for baseball here, and it is 80% winnings overall. Yeah, I remember you were here a couple weeks ago talking about some of these international sites. I bet you will continue to do really well using SaberSim on these international DFS sites, just because I don't imagine there's a lot of people doing that out there. Like, it's got to be probably pretty soft contests. I bet you are killing it. I think it would probably take one of the major US sites adding cricket for it to pop up on our radar. But if DraftKings or something like that adds cricket at some point, I could totally see us working on or at least getting some like raw projections up for a basic cricket model. I mean, Korean baseball was a big thing last year. It still is, at least on the apps. So I think we will follow what the market does in terms of what the sites are supporting. I know there's been a lot of questions on some of the new esports like Valorant and Dota. Now that those esports exist and are on the sites, they are on our radar to work on projections at some point. So I think we will follow what the sites are likely to do there. But I would 100% play cricket DFS if it was out there and we had a model for it. So yeah, we will see. But any other questions for me here today? Heading into the weekend, we will be back here again on Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern. So right back at it. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. I know we did have a little bit of app slowdown here today on stream, so thank you everybody for being patient with me as we kind of work through that. I'll go back to the team here, make sure everything's okay. It does seem like it got a lot better on the second half of the show, so it should be much improved. But you guys all have a great weekend. Again, thank you for making this a week of an awesome show here. I see one other question here. I'm gonna keep answering this since we have the time here. For NBA basketball, what metrics should I look at apart from projections? For example, DVP, pace, and so on. Man, you are putting me on my toes here with the basketball questions at this time of year here. I'm not so basketball focused at the moment, with it being the off season. Again, so our model is a very robust. These things like statistics that are like DVP, to the extent that they are important, and team pace and things like that, are already going to be taken into account in the model. So I would be careful about, this is true typically for most sports, I would be careful about going and looking up advanced stats of a certain player or a team, and then using them as a tool to adjust projections, because then what you are likely doing is double counting, right? So if you say, oh, I mean, again, I know we're talking about basketball here, but even saying something like Chicago plays really fast and so does Washington, so I think the pace of this game is going to be really high, and bumping up those team totals, well, they're already higher because we know that those teams play faster. So I would be careful looking at advanced stats like that and adjusting projections. Unless you hear explicitly from the SaberSim team that there's something that we're not currently taking into account, then I think you can add some value. Like things that came to mind are, at the moment, the golf model is not taking into account course difficulty. We take into account the size of the course, right? But not necessarily course like fit with certain golfers or the course difficulty overall. That's something you can do some research and value overall. That's just one that comes to mind. The big sport models like baseball, basketball, and football take into account a ton of information, and this typically isn't your greatest space to add value to the projections by looking at advanced stats. I would say in general, the next biggest focus that I would look at is ownership, and starting to think about a player's chance of being optimal, or how likely they are to end up in an optimal lineup, versus how owned they are, right? And then finding leverage there. I think, again, our projections are very dialed in general. NBA, it's very easy to project NBA, so a lot of projection systems are very dialed in. I think the edge that you find in NBA is, among other things, more finding opportunities where the field is going to over-own a certain player with that has a very slightly perceived greater edge than his other players at that salary range, right? This happens a lot with high salary players. A stud player playing in a perceived plus matchup ends up being pretty heavily owned, even though when you look at the names that are at the top of the salary range for any given night of NBA, right? It doesn't really actually mean that any one player's ceiling is much higher than another given the matchup, right? So, again, we're just on a random slate here, but I think maybe San Antonio is perceived as a team, or I guess Milwaukee, right? Especially for bigs. Like Milwaukee is a team that generally has this perception of being a tougher defense, especially for bigs. That's going to show up in projections here, right? Which is why we even see in our projections that Jokic's value is going to be a little bit lower, right? His point per dollar value is going to be a little lower. This is going to lead to typically player like Jokic having a bit of a lower ownership projection. But when we look at something like ceiling, you can see he's right up here with the other guys at the top, and his actual chance of being optimal is probably just as high as all of these other players. That's a lot of how like my NBA strategy is put together. Again, it's the off season here, so we're looking at a random February 8th slate. But that would be kind of like how I would think about this, right? The advanced stats, a lot of the stuff you're going to find out there, pace, defense against position. I don't even know if defense against position has predictive value. That's something I'm not super sure, but I know pace does. I know there's other things here on these like advanced stats, usage and things like that, right? They're already taken into account in the model. We don't need to go dig for those stats and adjust our projections for them. Instead, I would say look for ways to find leverage with your lineups and your roster construction overall. So, but kind of fun talking about basketball here, even though it just ended. It feels like it's been a long time since I've talked about basketball. So a little bit fun to have an opportunity for that. But great question. Again, I know we'll have football here like coming up in a month, and then right after that, we'll have a big rush for basketball season here in October, and we'll be talking about hoops here again pretty soon. So, but good question, and definitely one that I think is important to note when thinking about these projection models and the things that go into a model and avoiding double counting and things like that. So, but I am going to go ahead and leave it there, guys. If you have more questions for me, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. You can do that anytime over the weekend. We'll get to things in the order that they came in on Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can also email us, support@sabersim.com. Pop your questions in an email, fire them off. We'll get to those early in the show on Monday. Take care. Enjoy the slate tonight. Enjoy any DFS you're playing this weekend, and I will see you guys on Monday.